Go. Oh, we're good to go. Okay. Good evening and welcome to Pequot Library. I am Caroline Crawford and I'm so psyched to see so many friends here tonight for this very special Meet the Author. We are in for such a treat. What could be more fun and interesting than listening to two fabulous art professionals in conversation about everyone's favorite New York City icon, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Tonight's author, Christine Coulson, who I used to be friends with a long time ago. So good to see you. Began her art career at the Met in 1991 as an intern and worked her way through departments, hallways, paintings, so many adventures for over 20 years. Her book, Metropolitan Stories, is really a love letter or homage to the Met, as most of us will never get to experience. Characters, snapshots, vignettes, it's amazing. Tonight, we get to live vicariously through Christine's amazing experiences. Adrian Councilman is a great friend of mine and a longtime fan and supporter of Pequot Library. Adrian lives in Fairfield and has been in the art world for, Adrian, for a long time. I would say your entire grown-up life, right?
Yeah, 30 years.
Your entire grown-up life. If you haven't been to her gallery, ARC Fine Art, I encourage you to do so. Adrian has a great eye, is a consummate professional, offers spectacular ranges of art. She'll guide you in the right way on how to build an art collection. She's really the best. Her collection, there's something for everyone. And she is just the best in the art world. And we're so happy to have her here. So thank you, Adrian.
Thank you, Karen.
Christy and Adrian's lives overlapped in art world and before that at Williams College. And it's fortuitous and fun that Pequot Library is bringing these great gals together again. Before I get started, I just want to thank Finley Shaw of Finley's Fiction for making this introduction to Christine Coulson. Finley is our book sponsor. And if you'd like to purchase Metropolitan Stories, and we know you will, please do so at finleysfiction.com. Christine and Adrian will be in conversation for 35 minutes, and then we'll happily take your comments, suggestions, questions, everything you might have, and you can put those in the Q&A or the chat box. Christine Coulson, Adrian Councilman, thanks for being here. Let's get the party started. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Caroline. This is such a treat for me to be here with Chris tonight. It was exactly 30 years ago that we missed each other at the Met in the same very Department of European Paintings, which is kind of hard to believe, but she was an intern in the summer and then I came in the fall. And we then didn't overlap at Williams, but we passed each other at Christie's one summer. And so it's nice literally 30 years later to reconnect with someone who has spent her entire career up until now in one of my most favorite places in the entire world. So thank you for being here. It's such a treat.
Thank you.
And we're all super excited to kind of delve into this wonderful love letter, as Caroline and others have called it, which I think is a really apt name. I want to start though on page 1, just because there's a great little passage you begin with, and I'd love to hear kind of what you intended by these words. The chapter is called We, and you write, "We protect them and save them and study them. After time, we realize, some of us slower than others, that they are protecting us, saving us, studying us." And I'm just sort of curious what you meant exactly by those words.
Well, that opening sort of almost prologue to the book called We was really an effort to kind of set down right at the beginning who we are as the staff. This book is an attempt to kind of really show readers the Met's 2 collections as I see them, which one is the works of art that you know, and which I feel like have almost human characteristics, which comes through in the book. But the other collection that I think is equally as precious is the staff itself. And often the people who you don't know and don't see and who don't have the more senior roles in the museum, and I write a lot about the guards and the guys who change the light bulbs, and the connective tissue of the museum is really upheld by people like that, and they're very unsung. And so setting out right in the beginning of the book of who we are as a group, there's 2,200 employees at the Met. So it's a big family and has lots of eccentricities, but setting that out about this idea that people who are devoted to the Met are often devoted to the Met for a kind of reason that you don't really understand at the beginning and grow to realize over time. And that tends to be a kind of dependency on the art and those objects.
Right.
And so that idea that we as caretakers of these things are dedicated to their survival and study and all of that. I actually think in the end, particularly in writing this book, it's quite the reverse, that those objects are kind of sustaining us in a way that we often don't recognize. But that is a sort of quiet addiction of all of us.
Right. I can sense that even as a visitor to the museum who goes often, you kind of get that attachment, and they do feed you, these objects.
Right, and you have specific objects that you are attracted to and that you then go back to, and like that's sort of this relationship develops.
Right.
And I think one of the things I wanted to capture in the book is this idea that having been there for 25 years, some people go to the Met once in a while, some people go there once in a lifetime. But the difference was, and you got a taste of this when you were an intern there, being there every single day for 25 years, often with no one else there, walking through those galleries where all you hear are your own footsteps on the floor. There's something that develops in that relationship between you and the collection because you have that intimacy and that daily encounter. It's like people at work, you develop this kind of relationship with them that is based on like daily interaction, like what'd you do last night or whatever. And so we kind of developed that with the works of art. And so it breaks down a lot of the intimidation that people feel around the museum, and that they feel like they're supposed to know what they're looking at and they're supposed to have a sense of context. And I think that's really daunting for a lot of visitors. And so I kind of wanted to give people another entry point and to look at those objects the way that we can look at them, because a lot of the time we spend there, that's taken away and we get to.
Right. Well, and that sort of leads into a few other questions I have, which you've kind of touched on a little bit in speaking about that. Your choice to sort of personify the objects and give them a life and a story and relay their history. It was so fascinating. I just wondered, obviously it's kind of clear why you did it, to bring people maybe closer in, look beyond the surface, to make them maybe more approachable. But was there something that kind of triggered that initial thought, like, I'm going to bring this sofa to life? Or, how did you come up with that idea? Because it is pretty surreal. And at first, when you're reading the book, you're kind of taken back by it. Like, what is this?
Right. So in chapter two, for those who haven't read it, chapter 2 is told from the perspective of an 18th century chair in the period rooms of the Wrightsman galleries. And the specific chair I chose for a reason, because it still has its original upholstery on it, which is quite rare for an 18th century chair. And to me, and it's by no means the most important object in that room, which is filled with glittering surfaces and chandeliers, and Marie Antoinette's dog bed is in there. So stiff competition. And off to the side is this chair. And I always knew that it had its original upholstery on it. It was quite special because of that. But to me, that also means that it has like 18th century dust in it. Like the stuff of the 18th century is physically in that chair. And there's 18th century dandruff in that chair. And I felt that there was like a sense of its own history and trajectory that was more potent in having all those original materials. And so I wanted to write sort of from the point of view of that chair, mainly because it occurred to me that there's something quite tragic for that chair, and in thinking about its long history, that now it's arrived in the most glorious kind of retirement home you can imagine. It's in the Met. It will be beautifully taken care of, long past our lifetimes, but it will never be sat in again. And so when you think about this thing and what it's designed for, it's to hold the human form, and the fact that we have completely shut that down. We will never let that happen again. And how ironic that is,
Right.
that the thing it was meant to do, when it reaches this glorious spot, it's not allowed to do. And so I liked the idea of the chair kind of yearning to be sat in again,
I
for
loved your
human
passage.
contact again.
Right.
You know, and I feel like we can almost be sensitive to that now, like in this time of COVID where we're not allowed to touch anyone anymore.
Right.
And you like crave a hug.
Right.
I just thought, like, imagine the chair just craving someone to curl up in it. And so pulling that backward and thinking about the kind of memory it might have about the people who did sit in that chair, was a way to kind of, you know, think about an object that has been somewhat sort of sterilized in a way. And museums do that. You know,
Right.
we put beautiful lighting and velvet ropes in front of these objects, and they're sort of no longer allowed to do what they're supposed to do.
Right, exactly. I loved your few words where the chair is sort of yearning for the little boy to come and jump on it, you know. Of course, he's not allowed to. But
Right. And I think that
clever.
that moment of craving
Right.
it's really interesting right now for us to think about. But I do think it's a way for people to also remember that these objects do have these long and quite complicated histories.
Right.
I think sometimes we forget that, and that some of that history for something like that chair, you know, that includes like many, many years just in storage.
Right.
So imagine that object sitting in that darkness, and I write about, you know, the crack of light that comes when the storage door opens, and sort of longing to be the chosen one who might be taken out of storage. I think there's you know, and you think about this long history of objects and, you know, ancient objects that were in tombs at one point, and
Right.
sort of what happened when that tomb door opened, and I just think it's sort of a way of recognizing history, and the longevity of history.
Right.
That we sometimes forget when we're caught up in style and form and iconography and all the things that we as art historians kind of participate in.
And I think it actually, once readers read your book and then go visit the museum, I think they're going to look at some of these objects differently, or just generally look at art differently, because it really kind of forces you to think about its past, and not just the fact that it's, you know, positioned there on the wall or in a room. It makes you think about, what was this before? Where did it live? Who owned it? What did it serve? What purpose did it serve? So
right. And in some ways, those are the most basic questions to ask of any object.
Right.
But we kind of forget to do it.
Yeah.
And so that idea of like, why did the artist make the choices that they did?
Right.
Why did they put that one thing next to the other? Like, you know, I'm always really interested in the edges of pictures, like what's going on the edge of things, and because those decisions were made.
Right.
And I think the wonderful thing about looking at a work of art in that way is that at the Met, just beyond that is the most extraordinary scholarship you can imagine, to give you all the answers. And so you can let your eye guide you to the object that is attracted to you, and then let the Met kind of take you into the depths of all that we know about those things. And, you know, that I write a whole chapter about curators, and to me, the curators of the Met are like the dancers at the ballet. I mean, they are, that chapter is called The Talent for a reason, because I do think their eye, their mind, what they know is so exceptional. And everything I ever did at the Met was always in service of their work. And so what a glorious thing to be able to kind of find the object that speaks to you, think about it in whatever way you'd like as you explore it, but then have this trove of knowledge just sitting there. And so I think that combination is really lovely. And I hope that people will look a different way.
Yeah, I think they will. And I love the way that you weave sort of fact and fiction, or, you know, truth and imagination throughout the different stories. And I just wonder if you can speak to that a little bit on, you know, there's obviously so much factual information you could have drawn on. There's so much historical, you know, history and narrative, but you chose to create some fictitious moments that are quite frequent through it, and for the reader to know what's real, what's not real. why did you do that exactly? I mean, what is the reasoning behind weaving in fiction?
Well, I wanted to write a novel. I never wanted to write, I wasn't that interested, and I didn't want to write a memoir or anything like that. I wanted to write about what it actually feels like to live there. And in doing that, I think some of the most surreal moments in the book are actually the most honest. You know, so that as strange as it gets, that's sort of what I take away from that experience. But I also feel like it would be hard for the reader to take those leaps of imagination without some real grounding in the sort of authentic
Right.
Rituals and traditions of the museum itself. So I never mess with the collection. I never mess with the physical building. The entire book takes place within the museum. Everything is where I say it was. Everything. So there's a foundation of fact that allows you, when things go off the rails and the chair starts talking, to feel like you're ready for that. And I think you need that combination. And I think even as people read and they're wondering, is that true? Is that true? I think that the truth is what makes it feel right. And I didn't want anyone to know what was true and what wasn't true. I think for some, there's amusing things that are true, but often those are the nugget of a story, the kernel that started me writing. But then at some point, these characters have to take on a life of their own, and they have to be able to kind of have their own legs, or you wouldn't want to read it. I mean, it would be to tie yourself too much to reality. I don't think works when you're writing fiction.
Right.
I think the best example, though, and I will read this because this is real, and it was a great point of departure for me as a writer. I had heard this story for decades, and it's one of the great. The Met really functions in a very familial way, and the staff cafeteria, which I also write about, is like a daily Thanksgiving dinner where we rehash the same old tired stories over and over and over again. And this memo, which I'll read now, is one of them. And this memo is real, and I never saw it until about 10 years ago. A curator slipped this to me. And I just kept it and put it in a file, not knowing I would later write a book and this would be a pivotal part of it. But the Metropolitan Museum of Art Interdepartmental Memorandum to Richard M. Trackner, Senior Vice President, Operations, from Philip Peterson Little, Chairman, Department of Musical Instruments, April 27th, 1994. While preparing for our benefit concert last evening, members of my department encountered a naked couple engaged in the pursuit of carnal knowledge in a closet of the Uris conference room. Of course, we musicians are used to such youthful enthusiasm, but if this usage is to be encouraged, the closet doors should be equipped with an inside lock to prevent interlopers from being nonplussed, and staff users should be asked to check the day sheet first for possible schedule conflicts. What I love about that memo, and it does a lot of work for me to sum up the Met at this time. Most of this book takes place in the 90s. It's a completely analog world. It's a very old-fashioned place. And, you know, people are still using carbons and hand delivering memos and things like that. And memos like that were the kind of correspondence between departments. And they were quite formal, and people's full titles and full names were always used. And that kind of, the way that memo is written really sums up the sort of culture of the museum. And what I love is that the problem isn't really that people are having sex in the closet. The problem is that they haven't consulted the day sheet first to decide which closet to have sex in. And that is so Met in the most wonderful way. And so as a writer, I have this memo, and now I get to make up those characters who would wind up in that situation and develop them into that larger narrative that you experience. But that having that point to leap from
a great
Yes.
story. One of the funnier ones. It really gets you
And,
engaged.
and that's the kind of story that would circulate. And I never knew, I never knew who those guards were, but I heard that story 1,000 times.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's great actually how much voice you do give to the guards. And there's a lot of different stories that kind of bring them in, because they are the unsung heroes. And they are actually the people that probably spend the most time with this art, really, when you
And
think.
they're the people who see the most. I mean, I think the guards are the great like dot connectors. They're
Right.
the ones who see who like goes out to lunch with whom and
Right.
what's happening there and who's late for that meeting. I mean, I feel like there's a kind of, there's a knowledge base there that, and I always make the guards in the book, these sort of wise, omniscient people, because
Right.
I always, I think of them that way.
Right.
Discreet sometimes too, but
You know, it's very clever and amusing and kind of unexpected in a way, just because they are the unsung people that we don't really hear much about. I loved your chapter on the muse, the musing with the, and I just thought it'd be fun, you know, to share a little bit of that, because it was based on some incident, but then again, you sort of use your imagination to go through the collection in a way, which is, I thought, very fun and amusing, just to see your choices of different female figures that come forward as muses. So I don't know if you want to talk about that passage.
well, that is a chapter that begins, it's a chapter devoted to the director, and I will fully admit, and it's the only admission I'll make about truth, that director, it's not going to be a surprise to anyone who knows him that it is based on the great director who the book is devoted to, of 31 years at the Met, Philippe de Montebello. There was no way I could write a book and not have, you know, the great character of the Met included. Again, I start with this character that is, you know, sort of loosely based on him, but as far the chapter gets very extreme, and I can assure you I had no access to the information that's in that chapter.
Right.
So that's all fictionalized, but again, the initial truth of that story was that in about 1996, I delivered a memo to Philippe about a meeting he was going to have with Karl Lagerfeld. And the memo said, Mr. Lagerfeld will bring his muse. The muse will not speak. Do not address the muse. And so here I am, I delivered this memo to him, this kind of briefing memo about this meeting. This thing is in there about his muse. And you know, in my mind, I immediately think like, well, what if Philippe brought his own muse to the meeting and there was like a muse showdown? And he's got plenty to choose from. And it's not till 23 years later when I sit down to write that I think of that story, and I build a story about essentially the director of the Met shopping for a muse from the collection to bring to a meeting. And so there's this kind of audition that happens in his office of all the muses from Greek and Roman and the American wing, and they're all kind of crowding around his outer office. And it was a nice way to think about the collection and think about the whole nature of the muse, but it is based in the texture of the Met, but it also, as the director is going through that process, there are lots of small little details in there that are very much the way we would have run that kind of process.
Right.
He did make that request. We could have done it, and this is how we would have done it.
Right.
So it was fun to write about that way. And Philippe has been an incredibly supportive and good sport about characterization.
All right. No, it's very clever and amusing. And I love, you know, the negative attitude towards all the American art, and it's just,
I'm not giving any secret there that
yeah, no, I know.
Part of American art.
All right, it's just my area, so I always find it's the least interesting. In any case, yeah, that was very clever. And I wonder also, so you say you kind of had these experiences over 2 decades before you thought about writing a book, but were you someone that ever took a journal, or wrote a journal, or kept notes, or is it really, you know, just stories from your past that you're going back to and remembering? you
I
write?
didn't,
Did you
I
think
never
about
wrote
it as a
anything
book
down.
ever before 17?
I
Right.
never wrote anything down. I kind of, I kept it all in my head.
Right.
Which I think is a process in itself that I sort of believe in. I mean, I was always writing the Met story in some way. I was a speechwriter for 8 years there. And so I was always writing there, but always in someone else's voice. And so when I decided to think about writing a book, the Met was wonderful and gave me a year-long sabbatical to do it in 2017. And that was a terrific commitment on their part to allow me to do that. But it also gave me the best of all things, which is a really harsh deadline. So I did write the book in a year. But by the time I sat down to write, these stories had been, stewing in my head for so long that it just came pouring out of me. And so it was very much the book I intended to write. I just didn't know how I was going to do it. And so what came out was, all of these different threads through 23 years worth of work that I got to weave together. And then I worked very hard once I had a lot of text on the page to kind of come up with the structure that ultimately defines the book. I really didn't want to write a book of stories. What I wanted to write was a novel kind of in parts. And the difference between a book of short stories and this book is that you have to read these stories in order. You won't understand chapter 11 if you haven't read the previous 10. And so that idea of slowly revealing information or looping back on something that you may have heard about in a previous chapter and sort of creating that structure took a lot. And it was really an important part of the whole process of creating that structure so that when you get to the end, which is probably the most, outlandish part of it, you're ready for that. And so I was writing to that ending. And that takes a lot of kind of work in a non-linear way.
Right. I can see that. I started reading it again for a second time because I'd read it a while back. And having read it before, it was one of those things where you do reference things often or go back to it. And it is, a second read is actually kind of wonderful.
And I think that element of where to put things in, it's not always that the reader catches every reference. But it works enough to make you feel secure. And there's a scaffolding there that I don't think you always recognize, but it's in place. And I think it grounds things. And I was very committed to writing the book it's 16 chapters from 16 different points of view. And if you're going to ask the reader to take on 16 different perspectives, you have to give them something to hold on to. So that was I loved the challenge of that. I loved kind of paring it all down to its real essence. It's like that, is it Mark Twain quote? It's like, I would have written less, but I didn't have enough time. That hard work of getting it to, that chair story is only 3 pages. But it represents so much effort to get to that.
No, it is amazing. It's so short. I went back and I was like, wait, is that really all that was? But there was not in it. I thought it was interesting too. At the end, you introduce Edith, who's sort of the young, eager newbie at the Met, who's going to step into the role of someone that had just died, the rubber band man. And I kind of, did you kind of identify with that character? I mean, could you see yourself as a young person 25 years earlier, kind of in that role of wanting? I mean, she seemed determined. You had such, energy. The way you describe your earlier years going through the tunnels and whipping around like a sprightly, sprightly young thing, eager. And I was like, that's got to be Chris kind of at the beginning.
I know. I think a lot of people sort of say, which one is you? And my answer is always the same. They're all me. Every one of them is me, because it's all of these characters, they're so inflected by my point of view. And so this is so much my Met, and I wanted to write from that point of view in my early days at the museum. 25 years is a long time, and I started as the most like low on the totem pole assistant. And then later I was, a very senior figure there. And so I kind of wanted to write about those early days when I was so wide-eyed, and the museum was run by these very larger than life characters. And because it was an analog world and everything didn't function on email, you were often in the room with those people.
Right.
And so I feel badly for assistants today. They don't get that experience of that proximity to these very senior figures. I mean, I was getting them coffee or, taking notes or something, but I was in the room.
Right.
And so I had this kind of sense of who these people were and what they did and what the protocols were. And I was really steeped in that. And I sort of felt like, and I do reflect this in one of the chapters, like I had found my tribe. Like, these are my people, and like, I want in.
I want to be here.
But I'm not sure I would have gotten that with the same strength if I didn't have that access.
Right. Well, as you were saying in the book about delivering the cheeses, the yellow envelopes. And I mean, I remember very vaguely, because it was 30 years ago, running the bowels of the Met underneath, delivering, doing the sort of random, delivering a mail or whatever it was we were doing. But it was actually so firsthand and so direct, taking you into those offices of other people, having to knock on the door and address, a senior figure. So you're right.
And those 17 curatorial departments, the Met has these 17 areas. And if you walk into the American Paintings department, it is wildly different than when you walk into the Department of Photographs or the Department of Egyptian Art. And so there was something about, delivering mail to all those different places where you got access to all these different worlds that were represented with these different dynamics and these eccentric characters who were very senior figures in the museum. But then there you were dipping into their world, even if it was just to deliver the mail. And then that ownership of the museum, 4 blocks long, 2 blocks deep, 2 million square feet, just knowing how to get anywhere at any time, the fastest way possible, up and down. I write about this in the beginning about how, we're kind of trained to kind of go up and down and around and over because we're going to dodge the public here and then go over here and come out this secret door, and that gets you into Arms and Armor. And so that sense of really like owning that building, and it takes a long time
to figure it out, right?
And so I think as you physically take possession of that place, you also have access to all these places that are kind of the opposite of the glamorous galleries, which are these gray and white corridors just behind. It's that kind of Downton Abbey, upstairs, downstairs thing. But that's where all the action is. And that's where anything's going on. But there's a kind of timeless quality in those basement hallways where you do feel the sense of the people who preceded you. You do feel like there was some woman just like me delivering mail in the 1920s, and she was walking the same path. And so the museum is a kind of holder of 5,000 years of history, but it's also a container for its own history. And you really felt that in those hallways, and you really felt the presence of that history.
Yeah, the continuity of the space and the fact that I haven't been through the basement since then, but I've been through the galleries. There's so much that is exactly the same as it always has been. I mean, obviously there are little improvements here and renovations and all of that, but the crux of it is the same. And I think that continuity is fabulous, because I remember feeling that even at Christie's on the Park Avenue spot, you felt like people had been there for a while and hadn't even been that long, but going into Rockefeller Center, it's like, oh, it's a new place, new business, new people. It didn't maintain any of that ethos, that sentiment of the history of these longstanding institutions. I mean, the Met, I think the fact that it's there and it looks the same. And I think you said the European Paintings Department is still behind that funny closed door in one of the galleries.
Yeah, totally.
I mean,
and there's still, there are these, there's a dumbwaiter in the basement. and you just think, I still don't know where that goes to, but like the idea, I just always want to open that door. And I always imagine you'd find a bunch of like old champagne glasses from some party in, you know, the 30s or something. So I think that very palpable sense of, you know, these kind of ghosts, very friendly ghosts in that, in the museum, it's a way to invoke all those people who came before us who equally devoted themselves. That's what it is. I mean, the Met is, you know, the aggregate of 150 years of devoted staff to create what you know today.
Right. Sort of before we take question and answers or questions, I would ask you, do you have, I mean, is it possible to have a favorite object?
Oh, I have a favorite object. Easy.
Okay, what is it? I'm curious.
It's like if there's a fire, it's the one thing I'm going to go see.
Oh my gosh, what is it? Tell us.
I should say that one of the things that if readers are interested, on my website, which is just christinecoulson.com, every work of art in the book is there.
Oh, great. That's
there are images of every done by chapter, so you can scroll through all the images, and then if you click on it, it'll link to the Met's website.
Right.
And so you can get to the
reason you didn't include illustrations or images. Was it just because you wanted it to be sort of fictitious and not like a...
I wanted to write a novel, and novels don't have pictures.
Okay. That was just
and so we created this companion because people were telling me, when I was doing my tour, people were telling me that they were Googling as they were reading. And I thought, well, that's not the experience I want either. So we created this very easy thing to navigate. Where you can see every object that's referenced in the book, so that you have that kind of visual as you go, and it makes it faster. I had, you know, it was a real decision as I was writing to decide how much to explain. Like, do I just mention Caravaggio and expect people will know who it is? And that was a fundamental thing. And I had to just do that because I couldn't every time say, you know, some preamble to get you to the Caravaggio. So we made a lot of leaps and just decided to just include those references in that breezy way that I often do. And so I think it's nice to have the images and that scholarship behind them.
Right. No, it's great. Well. People can go back and look and research, and, you know, if they want to know more, they didn't get the reference, you know, it's there.
Exactly. So if I had to save one thing though, my favorite work of art it's a pair of Egyptian jasper lips. It's the head of a queen. Okay. And it's made out of a piece of jasper. It's life size, and jasper it's this beautiful mustard color, solid piece of stone, but she's broken, and she's broken right here. And so it's incredibly modern looking. Right. She literally looks like she was carved last Thursday. I mean, it's so fresh, so exquisite. The lines around her lips are so intact and beautiful. And the idea of this thing that is 4,000 years old, but looks so modern and looks so both universal and specific at the same time. You feel like if you saw that woman in an elevator, you would know exactly who it was.
Wow, that's so intriguing. Is it on view always?
Yeah, always on view. It's right outside the Temple of Dendur, and it's she's extraordinary. And I find her very soothing in the sense, you know, a companion chapter that I wrote to that opening we chapter that we talked about at the beginning. After I wrote that, my editor at the time said, okay, now I want you to write a companion chapter to that. You just explained who you are as the staff thinking about the objects. Now I want you to write an echo of this, what the objects think of you. Oh. And so I wrote a chapter called Object Lesson, which is based on that. I can read a little bit of it because it explains itself. It's really about this idea that, and it opens with that same line, we protect them and save them and study them, all the while knowing that they think they're protecting us, saving us, studying us. And so that idea that the objects sort of know what they're doing, underpins this whole idea. But underneath that is another concept, which I think is the more, I don't know, the bigger concept of the book beyond just talking about the Met and the museum is this idea of survival. And so I'll read a little bit from that because I think it explains what I think about those works of art. Survival is a funny business too, a losing game, literally. They love us and we lose them all. The ones who made us, the ones who gave us, the ones who sat down and played with us, the ones who held us, or just laid eyes on us, the ones who bought, traded, and sold us, cleaned us, redeemed us, brought back the sheen on us, loved us, learned everything there is to know about us. Imagine how many reflections that ancient mirror has seen. Now imagine every one of them, dead, gone, but we live on. We are the proof, sticky but silent, hanging on that wall, standing on that pedestal, the proof that anyone was ever there at all.
It's brilliant. I love that passage.
And so I think that's part of what I love about that Egyptian jasper head is that that's the legacy of that woman, that culture, that artist, and it will outlive all of those visitors who see it.
Right.
And isn't that, I don't know, I find that soothing.
Right. It is. There's the continuity again.
Right.
Right. Well, yeah, I thought that was a nice, I didn't recognize it as, I remember reading those lines again from a different perspective, but I'm glad you brought that up because it's a nice tie-in with that whole concept. Should we take a few questions?
Sure.
There's a couple of questions in the Q&A box. The first one asks, this would be a fabulous film. Are there movie rights?
Maybe. There are movie rights and we're working on it.
Oh my God, that's very exciting.
We'll see. We'll see.
All right.
It's a very complicated process and it would be a very fun and beautiful movie, but wildly expensive.
Exactly. I can't even imagine. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
The next question is, what are you working on now and how much time do you dedicate to writing?
Well, I'm going to be working on the next book, which I'm trying to condense that 23-year-long process into about 6 months. I'm trying not to write right now, and I'll start writing probably in June. I'm incredibly disciplined and ritualistic when I write, to the point where I eat the same breakfast every day. I sit in the same chair in the same spot and for the same amount of hours every single day. And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't, but I trust that process and eventually it comes. And so there's no breaks, there's just you and the page. And I think that's really important for me. I know writers who can, jot down beautiful paragraphs on the subway, and I'm just not one of them. So it's all discipline for me.
Wow. So interesting. We have a question from Finley Shaw, our friend Finley. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. She asked about the new book. And then the last question that she asks is, what is currently on your bedside table?
A great book that if you enjoy Metropolitan Stories, I bet people would really respond to as well. A book by Dune Arbus, who is the photographer Diane Arbus's daughter. She wrote a book called The Caretaker, which is about a kind of very eccentric, odd little curator of something that is akin to a house museum. It's a sort of one man's collection, and the obsessive nature of the caretaker and her. She writes in almost a very old-fashioned way, but it's so fluid, and her descriptive text is so beautiful. You really can't stop reading. It's a small book, but a really powerful one. And I think there's a lot of links between the two books about, again, about objects and memory, and how we kind of hold memory and invoke it through objects of all kinds.
Wow, that's a great suggestion. Definitely check that out. And Jamie C is asking, what is one of the most overlooked but beautiful or powerful pieces of art in the Met, in your opinion?
Oh, well, I take the list from this book. In fact, there's another thing. I'm going to plug one more thing on my website, which is there's a tour of Metropolitan Stories that you can take, a walking tour of the objects in the book. And it's only like, I think it's 8 of them. But what's interesting about those objects is that they are all kind of what most people would think of as, well, they made it to the Met, but as somewhat minor works of art. They're not anyone's masterpieces by any stretch. You know, my favorite unsung work of art, of course, is that chair. I think there's amazing things in the tomb of Meket Rey, which is in the Egyptian galleries. And it's these wonderful recreations of Egyptian life from a burial chamber that the Met discovered in the 1920s. And they're overwhelming when you think about their age and their condition. But I also think what's really unsung about them is when you look really closely at them, what you see is like that the Egyptians had a brewery and a bakery, and there's a little garden, and all the details of those works of art, as you look at them, they kind of unpack themselves. And I often think people get sort of overwhelmed in the gallery by just the sheer magnitude of the story and the find. And I'd recommend digging into the details on that. You know, my big recommendation to people when they're going to the Met is very simple, and I think very important, which is to go there and just wander around yourself and look for the thing that stops you in your tracks. And that could be anything. It could be a piece of Assyrian glass. It could be a textile from the Renaissance. It could be anything. But then once you find that thing, maybe don't read the label and spend 15 minutes looking at it. And I mean, really looking at it. And that's a long time to spend with a work of art. But again, look at those edges and ask why the artist made the decisions that he or she did, and kind of allow yourself to relax around it. And that's not what our normal position is in museums. And then the most important part of that process is really when you're done and that 15 minutes is up, leave. Just walk out. Leave the museum, take that object with you in your mind, and it will stick with you. It will stay with you. And the next time you come back, you'll have a different relationship with it than you did. You'll see it like an old friend. You have a different understanding of it. And I love the idea of visitors kind of collecting objects the way that we've collected them in the museum. Collect your own group of, you know, unsung stars and find them based on your own eye and like what hits you in the gut. And that's the beauty of a place like the Met, is you can wander around and find that thing. I just think people usually don't do that. They're usually headed to an important exhibition, or they want to, you know, go back and see the Rembrandts or the Van Goghs. And I kind of recommend staying away from that for a little bit and find something new.
That's fantastic. I have a question from Jane Dean for both of you. By any chance, was Lane Faison still at Williams when you two were there? I know he taught and inspired something like 5 directors of America's top museums. I've always been very interested in him.
Lane was around. He was retired, but he still came to all the art history parties. So yes, he was around. And he seeded an incredible generation. Lane Faison and Whitney Stoddard was there, who was a great medieval scholar. And they had some kind of magic because they inspired all these football players to become art historians, and they all became museum directors.
That's so great. Well, both of you have totally inspired all of us. We appreciate you sharing your time and talent and great experiences with Pequot Library. And on behalf of Pequot Library and Stephanie Coakley, our executive director, thank you, ladies. This was amazing.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
For being here. We appreciate you.
I hope now that spring is here, everyone gets to the Met.
We'll be there soon. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Adrian. Have a great night, everyone. Take
Thanks
care.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank-
Bye.